Hi, my name is Charles Harrison. I'm going to be doing an analysis of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. He was born February 12th, 1809, and died April 15th, 1865. I'm going to go through his presidency, his political campaign, and his strengths and weaknesses. This is a picture I found of a political poster for President Lincoln and his Vice President Hannibal Hamlin. For his 1860 campaign, there was 4 candidates on the ballot. Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, John Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat, John Bell, constitutional unionist, and Abraham Lincoln as the Republican Party candidate. At the time, there were 19 free states and 15 slave states, so there was a big divide in the country as a whole on the issue of slavery. As far as the Democratic Party, there was a split because they didn't want to have a pro-slavery platform. And for John Bell, the constitutional unionist, comprised of the Whig Party and the Southern Democrats, and with Abraham Lincoln in the Republican Party, they had 17 principles that they stood on, 10 of which included topics like the free soil, preservation of the Union, the Fugitive Slave Act, and slavery in general. The Republicans wanted to capture all 19 free states. Lincoln at the time was relatively unknown. He was a lawyer arguing cases in 1936, just public cases, and passed his bar exam in 1837, actually becoming a lawyer. He also was a secretary in the Whig Party for different political functions. He won the 1860 presidential election with 40% of the popular vote, about 180 of the 303 electoral votes. He was removed from the slave state ballots. In 1864, he ran again against George McClellan. This was during the Civil War, dropping the 303 electoral votes to 233 electoral votes. He was supported by Union troops and had a big push for victory in Atlanta. He won 55.1% of the popular vote and 212 of the 233 electoral votes. I added a quote here from his second inaugural address: "With malice towards none and charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." This is from his first presidential inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. His first year in presidency, I laid out a couple different proclamations. This is from presidencyucsb.edu that kind of puts forth different points of note during his presidency and its 5 years that he did serve. Also, a little bit from the American Yop and different pictures and analysis from the Library of Congress at www.loc.gov. The first proclamation was calling forth militia after Fort Sumter surrenders. Losing the battle there, they basically sparked off the Civil War. Proclamation 81 was the blockade of ports in rebellious states, as well as Proclamation 82, blockading additional states. This was to stop imports and different materials and kind of trying to put a strain on the war effort of the rebellious states. Proclamation 83 was to increase the size of the military. He then signed an act of suppression of rebellion. This was strongly against the succession. He didn't want the succession to happen, and so with this act was to suppress of the rebellion. He then signed a complex revenue act. Anything over $800 was taxed 3%. Then signed an act for his use of emergency military action. Signed compensation acts that was able to seize property, including slaves, as slaves then were seen as property, and with the war starting off, good way to drain resources from the rebellious states was to seize property and slaves. Proclamation 86, he prohibited trade with the rebel states. Basically, his whole first year was to put strain on the rebellious states in need of the war effort. He ended his first year with his annual State of the Union, where he discussed ways to encourage freeing of slaves and calls for a plan for the colonization of the freed slaves. In 1862, put his first war order, basically calling forth the soldiers and Navy in war. He put in an executive order for political prisoners. Recommended to Congress the emancipation of slaves in March of 1862. He prohibited the military returning of captured slaves. Put in Proclamation 89, the termination of the blockade in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Louisiana. He put in the Homestead Act, executive order taking possessions of railroads. He signed Act 12 Sat 432, eliminating slavery in the U.S. or in any territories of the U.S. He signs Act 12 Sat 502, Oath of Federal Officers, basically having the federal officers give an oath that they wouldn't aid, spy, or give any information to the rebellion. He signs the Morrill Act, donating land for colleges, agriculture, and mechanics, boosting the need for agriculture and mechanics. And then he put a message out to Congress about emancipation on July 4th. Also in 1862, he signed Act 12 Sat 566 to grant pensions to the military. He signs the Second Confiscation Act, freeing any slaves of anyone participating in the rebellion, causing a lot of slaves who were captured or under capture to flee to the North and the free states. He signed Act 12 Sat 579, amending the act calling forth a militia that freed slaves. This also would free their mothers and their children. Proclamation 93, declaring the objective of war, including emancipation of slaves in rebellious states. And then he had his State of the Union discussing colonization of freed Americans of African descent. And also at the time, Native tribes were in subordination. Proposes a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. the end of the year, he signs Act 12 Sat 653, admitting West Virginia to the Union pending proclamation. In 1863, had Proclamation 95, which was the Emancipation Proclamation. Signs Act 12 Sat 664, establishing the Arizona Territory. He signed the National Banking Act, making one currency for the entire nation. And signs Act 12 Sat 808, establishing the territory of Idaho. He signs the Habeas Corpus Act, which at the time was basically taking away the right for you to go and see a judge and have a trial, and taking away rights of the Constitution. Proclamation 100, admitting West Virginia to the Union. General Order 143, Bureau for Organizing of Colored Troops. We also had the New York draft riots, with the strain on the nation. They started drafting, and people were not happy, and we had a lot of different people in rebellion, basically, against the draft, as the strain not only affected the House, but it also affected the nation, and caused riots in New York. Proclamation 104, suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Proclamation 107, called to 300,000 volunteers. You had his Gettysburg Address, which reframed the war to focus on the freeing of slaves. Proclamation 108, amnesty and reconstruction for Confederates who accept prior proclamations on slavery, giving amnesty to people who would accept these proclamations and turned from their rebellious ways. In 1864, he signs Act amending the Act for calling and enrolling the national forces. Draft was authorized. He put in an executive order to make Ulysses S. Grant commander of the armies. Proclamation 111 limits amnesties on non-POWs. Senate joint resolution to adopt the 13th Amendment happened. Executive order to arrest and imprison irresponsible reporters, which is pretty radical in my eyes. Signs Act 13 Sat 85, establishing territory of Montana. He repealed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required slaves to be returned to their owner. Proclamation 113 declares martial law and suspends habeas corpus in Kentucky. Proclamation 116 calls for 500,000 volunteers, draft in areas where those numbers were not met. Proclamation 119 admitting Nevada to the Union, and he won his election against George McClellan. Proclamation 121 at the end of the year, calling for 300,000 volunteers. In 1865, his second term, House of Representatives passes resolution on 13th Amendment. Hampton Roads Peace Conference, Lincoln, Seward, and two Confederate cabinet members, and Lincoln all sat down to discuss the terms of peace. Signs Act 13 Sat 507, relief for freedmen and refugees. Proclamation 124, offering pardon to deserters. Executive order to arrest persons engaged in intercourse and trade by sea with insurgents. Proclamation 125, arrest to those providing arms to hostile natives. Executive order for raising flag, other commemorations at Fort Sumter. And then Lee surrendered in North Virginia, and Lincoln was assassinated shortly after on 4/14/1865. It's a picture of his second inaugural address. Go into his strengths and weaknesses that I take note on. His strengths, obviously, he was considered honest Abe. He spoke his mind, and was honest, and he had integrity. He was a good communicator, able to honestly bring forth his views and what was needed. Was also able to listen and retain and respond. He understood the law as being a lawyer. He was faithful. He was smart. He had very minimal schooling. He was steadfast. He was determined in his presidency to keep the Union as one, and also abolish slavery and free the slaves and bring forth what our Constitution actually called for. He led the victory in the Civil War, and he led during the abolition of slavery. For his weaknesses, I see some weaknesses as a little bit, at the time it might have been needed, but for a look back on if it was the right thing to do, I'm not sure. So I say it might be a weakness because I'm not sure on it. But the suspension of habeas corpus, he expanded the power of the federal government. He gave too many chances and should have acted more in some areas. And he arrested reporters. With two of those, it goes against what our Constitution says. In a time of war, it might differ, and maybe I'm too harsh on that point, but I believe that he might have gone a little too far as arresting reporters and then taking the writ of habeas corpus away. And our Constitution does say in a rebellion that this is enabled, but it was to what extent and what resulted, and as far as how our law works, I don't know. But yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.